So thank you so much for coming to my session. I am a certified rescue scuba diver, and I also work in information security. It turns out that these fields have a lot in common, primarily that there's just inherent risk in what we do. In order to reap the benefits, we have to understand and assume a certain level of risk. Secondly, panic makes everything worse. In both situations, when you panic, you're going to compound all of your problems. And the third thing that I find that they have in common is that our natural instincts are often wrong. And so we do have to learn how to train our minds and train our bodies to respond in a way that is going to be productive and helpful for the situation and to help us get to the best outcome. So a little bit of background on myself, just so you have a sense of where I'm coming from and kind of how I developed my perspective. I am the founder and CEO of a communications consultancy called Discernible. And we focus exclusively on helping cybersecurity teams, privacy teams, and risk teams in how to communicate to other stakeholders. So whether that's their executives and business teams, their employees, their customers, sometimes media and the public, talking about security and privacy and in really productive and easy to understand ways for all of those different stakeholders. Prior to starting this company, I led security, privacy, and engineering communications at Uber, as well as security communications at Facebook and AT&T. And before that, I was a consultant at another company working with a bunch of other companies on exactly the same thing. So I have gone very, very deep in one particular area of cybersecurity. I started my undergraduate studies in marine biology. That's actually where the scuba diving started in my life. Also probably why you're going to see a lot of shark photos in this presentation. But I ended up getting a master's in corporate communications, and so I married those two experiences into a career in cybersecurity because it turns out that sharks and hackers have a lot in common, and communicating about them depends on a lot of the same principles in terms of how do we talk about things that do have inherent risk, but that we can't completely avoid in order for our lives to be productive. I'm also a co-organizer and the press department lead at DEF CON, so if any of you are familiar with that event, I'm involved in that. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm also a certified rescue scuba diver. Are there any other certified divers here in the room? Amazing. If you're already certified, I highly recommend looking into Patty's psychological diver course. It's only a couple of years old, but it is amazing. And I'm going to touch on a lot of the principles from that course throughout this presentation. Does anybody know what the #1 cause of diving emergencies is?
Water.
Any other guesses?
Delta P.
It's poor judgment. And you want to know what causes poor judgment? Panic is one of them. But also sometimes we make poor choices even before the emergency happens. That leads to the emergency, right? How many times have we been in a security incident that should have been very small and should have been easy to mitigate, but then our CES says something really stupid on the news and now it's like a full-blown incident that's impacting stock price, right? So we want you to think as we go through this today, think about where are we making decisions and where does poor judgment come into play throughout the entire incident response process? Because when I focus particularly on executives, and I'll get to this later on, they have a very important and critical role in incident response, particularly as it relates to judgment. And if they are distracted with other things, or if they are panicked, their decision-making abilities are going to be impacted as well. And so it's something that we can do as the security team to actually focus their attention on the right things, make sure that they're not being overtaken by panic so that the things that they are responsible for, where we need them to make a decision, they're actually optimized and performing at their best. So I'm going to start a little bit just with background about what panic is and how it impacts us. So panic, essentially, when we feel like that sense of anxiety or panic, it triggers our primitive brain. So the amygdala is located the back of your brain, and it's responsible for your fight, flight, or freeze response. Freezes happen all the time to panicked divers. They just go limp. Sometimes they will also, as I mentioned in the beginning, sometimes our natural instincts aren't always the right thing to do. When you're underwater and you're under pressure and something goes wrong, a lot of times our natural instinct is, I just need to get to the surface where I can breathe. And I've seen panicked divers shoot to the surface despite having everything that they needed to breathe underwater. They still had air, their equipment was functioning just fine. But they get scared and they race to the surface. And this is particularly dangerous in scuba diving, because as you get closer to the surface, the pressure around you decreases, and so the air inside you expands. And it's really easy to blow a lung by shooting to the surface too quickly. And so at the same time that our primitive brain is being triggered by this panic, this alarm bell in our mind, it's also inhibiting the more evolved parts of our brain. So, things in your frontal cortex like verbal thought, judgment, and planning. So not only is panic an incredibly uncomfortable experience to just go through, it actually makes it so much harder for us to actually execute those higher level cognitive functions that we need in something like an underwater emergency or security incident. And so when problems occur, whether it's a security incident or a diving emergency, our responses can either help us lead us to a fix of the situation, or it can make it worse, right? It's one of the reasons why we train over and over and over again, not just as rescue divers, but as incident response professionals, so that a lot of what we need to do in that moment is muscle memory for us. I can identify an emergency underwater very quickly so that I know what to do to mitigate that situation, right? But the more stress that we feel, the more likely we are to we're gonna lose the ability to remove that source of stress, right? If I'm with a diver who is panicked because maybe they got a cramp in their leg, or they're having pain in their ears because they haven't equalized properly, the more stress they get, the harder it's going to be for me to tell them the right things that they need to do. Which is why as rescue divers, we are trained on how to do things regardless of what the panic diver would want us to be doing. There's even scenarios that we have to practice where if they are panicked, we can go behind their tank where they can't reach us, so they can't pull on our regulators or our tubes or anything, and we can safely get them to the surface where help is waiting. But it's important to keep in mind that, again, the more stress we get, the worse it's going to be, right? So those of us that are involved in incident response all the time, it's helpful for us to develop these skills on our own, but also to think about the other stakeholders and those executives who are in this situation with us as well. So to top that off, perceived threats are enough to trigger our panic response, right? So even if you're not actually in danger, and I took this photo, by the way, not in danger. When you're actually in, just the thought of being in danger is enough to trigger your amygdala and activate that limbic system, which leads to that panic response. And this is a positive feedback loop between the physiological response and how our brain responds, right? So if any of you were in the meditation session this morning that was in this room, they went through a breathing exercise. which I use a lot, not only in scuba diving, but also in incident response coaching. Because I need both your body and your brain to understand that you're not in danger, or they could, negatively impact each other, right? So if your heart is racing, that actually sends a signal to your brain that there's a threat. And then it's this positive feedback loop and they feed off of each other. So we have to learn how to interrupt that process in order to convince our brains not to panic, right? And so the number one rule we have in rescue diving, which is probably going to seem very familiar to security professionals as well, is that the best way to deal with an emergency is to stop it before it starts, right? And I'm not only talking about like our technical defenses. Sure, we wish we could stop all like security incidents. That's not a reality. But it doesn't have to be an emergency. We decide whether or not it's an emergency by the way that we respond to it. And so in diving, we have a little bit of a checklist that we'll go through before we get in the water, right? Just to make sure, let's make sure that everything is working properly and that we've set expectations before we get into that situation of risk, right? So I look at all of the divers that are in our group. Is anybody nervous? Are they anxious? Are they antsy? Are they tired? Did they get enough to eat? Is anybody seasick? Right? Motion sickness can have a huge impact on our mental abilities while we're diving as well. So I'm looking at all of those things about my diver to understand what is their state of mind and how are they feeling in that moment before we even get into the water, right? I do the same thing with executives from day one. I am scanning these people to understand what makes them tick, what motivates them, how do they respond to stress. Right? Cybersecurity is not the only risk or the only issue that executives have to deal with, right? And so I want to understand how do they deal with other types of risk and other stressful situations. I'm also thinking about the environment. When we're going to a specific dive site, I'm thinking, is there an overhead environment? Where I live in Mexico, we have a lot of underwater caves. And getting hit in the head with a stalactite is not ideal. So I'm thinking about what is the environment like, not only so that I can prepare, but so that I can communicate to the other divers what to expect, right? Because nobody really likes surprises underwater unless it's a really amazing, encounter with an eagle ray. The next thing that we do is we go through a dive plan. We brief all of the divers before we get in the water. What to expect, what is our anticipated depth, right? You have a finite amount of air in your tank, and you have a finite amount of nitrogen that your body can absorb when you're under pressure, right? And so we have a plan for every dive, and we talk about that as a group. In fact, the saying that we have is plan your dive and dive your plan. Now, this is going to come into play a little bit later when we get into some of the security incident specifics, but I often hear people say, oh yeah, we have an incident response plan, but we don't follow it because it drives me crazy when people say you have to have a plan, but nobody ever really uses it. I'm going to tell you why there's two problems with that. One is that if your plan doesn't work, change it, because you need to have a plan. You have to. You don't know if your best, most experienced incident response team members are going to come to work that day or are going to be able to participate that day. Maybe they're out sick. Maybe they're having a family emergency. You have to have a plan that other people can follow, not just the people who have done this a million times before. The second thing is that if you go through a really serious incident that gets public exposure or requires a regulatory reporting obligation, the regulators are going to come check and look at your plan and whether or not you followed it. It is worse to have a plan that you didn't follow, because the regulators will want to know why you deviated from your plan. And if you have a lot of deviations from your plan, then you didn't really have a plan. So And I'll talk about this a little bit later. It's important to practice your plan over and over and over again as many times as you can through your daily operations, so that your plan is something that you can actually follow, that you can trust, and that you have confidence in. And not just you as a security team, but your executive team as well. Your executives will jump in the middle of your process if they don't trust it. If they're having this, they need to have this cathartic experience to do something, because believe me, they did not get to where they were by sitting still, right? And so we need to give them specific things to focus on, and we need to give them a plan that they understand, that they believe in, and that they trust, so that they will follow it. And then the last thing we do with our divers is that we check all of their gear, right? Are your regulators working so that you can breathe? That's important. Scuba divers have 2 regulators. We have an extra in case we need to share air with a buddy, in case they run out of air, or in case there's a malfunction in our primary regulator. We also need to make sure that all of the equipment we have for buoyancy, which is, whether or not you're floating in the water, if you're more dense or less dense than the water that you're in, we need to make sure that all of that equipment is working as well. I was actually talking to a fellow diver earlier today who was talking about how he had increased or decreased his air consumption, which is a huge achievement for any scuba diver, is to use the least amount of air as possible, because then your dive can last longer. And the easiest way to improve your air consumption is to improve your buoyancy, right? Being able to just float and coast through the water with very little effort. And so we want to make sure that all of that is working. If you're too heavy, or if you don't have enough weight in the water, you will struggle the whole time. And not only will you go through air faster, but it also, especially for new divers, can be an incredibly triggering experience to not feel like you have control. And so in both scuba diving and in cybersecurity, we need to understand the challenges that we might face during an incident, and we need to ensure that everyone, including our executives, have the proper skills and tools to deal with those challenges. So when it comes to executives, as I mentioned, I'm constantly monitoring their state of mind. I'm constantly monitoring their abilities. What are they good at? What are they not good at? What are their blind spots? And this isn't necessarily because I'm going to tell them how to fix it, again, depending on their personality. But I may need to compensate for that, right? When we dive with newly certified divers, we have extra weights with us. We will bring extra masks with us just in case they have an issue with their mask. We have to be prepared to kind of cover the blind spots and the weaknesses of the folks that we're working with. And a lot of that just has to do with their experience as well as their temperament. We also need to be mindful of the tools that the executives have, right? In terms of how are they getting information? What things do they have access to? Does our CEO have access to a Twitter account that we don't know about that's going to cause an issue with the SEC? Right, those types of things matter. And also, when I think about tools, I also think about like channels of information. Who are the resources and who are the people that the CEO is going to call before they call me or after they call me? I need to know who's in that circle and who has their ear, because that's going to, again, impact their perception of fear and risk and comfort with the entire situation. I also think about their experience, right? And everybody thinks they have more experience than they do, usually, by the time they become an executive. But I'm more interested in the type of experience they have, more so than the quantity of experience. So for example, we get lots of divers where I live in Mexico. A lot of tourists will come and they'll say, I have 400 dives, but they're all in the ocean. You have a lot more space to safely mess up in the wide open ocean than if you come diving with us in the caves. Your buoyancy has to be on point when you go cave diving. You just don't have room to go up and down. You're not going to make it through the narrow passages, and you're going to damage your body or your equipment if you're constantly hitting the rock formations. And so when I'm thinking about executive experience, I'm not just thinking about, how many incidents have they been through, but what types of incidents have they been through? What types of security experience and leadership do they have, right? It's very different if all they've ever gone through is ransomware compared to, okay, now we have a really irate, bug bounty researcher who's, on Twitter and pulling a lot of media attention towards us. And the last thing that I look at is the executive's comfort with this subject matter specifically. And when I talk about comfort, what I'm actually looking for is there public content from this company about cybersecurity other than, we've had a breach? Do they talk about security all the time? Are they engaged in the security community? Are they at conferences? Are they sharing best practices? Are they engaged in standards bodies? I'm looking for evidence that this company is comfortable talking about security when they don't have to. That makes a big difference. So here's just a couple examples that I pulled. Those on the left are blog posts about specific incidents. One is from Cloudflare, the other one's from GitHub. It doesn't really matter the company. But this is a lot more information than they've had to share publicly. But both of these companies have a very long history and a good reputation of doing this on a regular basis. That means that when they have really serious security incidents, all of their executives already know the routine, and they already know that it's not the end of the world to talk about when bad things happen. And in fact, both of these companies' reputation is increased by the fact that they are this transparent about their security experiences. The information on the right actually comes from Uber's ESG report from 2021. This is particularly important not because of the numbers themselves, but because of how much bureaucracy it takes to share this level of detail with your investors, right? So when I'm thinking about whether or not executives are comfortable with the subject matter of security in general, I'm looking for proof that they're willing to talk about these things when they don't have to, and that they understand the value in being transparent and having nuanced conversations with stakeholders. And so it's exactly the cross-functional approvals and the risk, whether real or perceived, where when I see these things, that tells me that this company, under the leadership of their executives, because these executives are involved in a lot of these public-facing content creation, that they're comfortable with the subject matter. They can talk about it in a way that doesn't make them feel like the house is on fire just because they said the word cyber, right? And again, keep in mind that even perceived risk has a lot to do with how executives react to the situation, right? It's why I had a number of people in my network tell me about with the Okta incident a couple of months ago. Was it months ago or weeks ago? Who knows what days are anymore in the after times. But the companies were too scared to talk to their customers about their exposure to the Okta issue, even when their exposure was zero. I love when our exposure is zero because we can talk about it very safely. There is no risk in talking about a zero exposure. But the companies were concerned that, if we talk about security, it's going to incite panic. It's not actually. We need to normalize talking about security on a regular basis so that when real shit hits the fan, that's not the first introduction that people have to our security team, our strategy, or any of our defenses, right? This needs to be something that we're comfortable talking about all the time, just in the way that I need scuba divers to be comfortable with their gear, with the environment, and with the process and procedures that they've been trained on. And so when we talk about specifically preventing executive panic, there's a couple best practices that I've learned throughout my career that I want to share with you today. The first is have a really, really good response plan. I mentioned this at the beginning. It's so important that your plan is actually enhancing and playing to the abilities of your executive team. If you have an executive who is a terrible public speaker, for God's sakes, don't put them on TV. Okay? It also needs to increase the comfort level of these executives. Every time they go through this plan with you, should make them more and more comfortable, not just with incident response, but with security in general. And so you'll see later on when I talk about why it's so important that we use our response plans as often as we possibly can, even if it's a minor incident. And then finally, the plan needs to be flexible, it needs to be sustainable, right? If the plan is so rigid that you're constantly deviating from it, your plan sucks. So there needs to be flexibility built into the plan, not necessarily prescriptive steps at every turn. I've had clients say, can we get a template for, when we need to make a public announcement about a data breach? I'm like, no, you definitely cannot, because it will be terrible. It will sound like you used a template, it will sound like your lawyer's read it, and it's not going to have the empathy or the context of the situation. But what you can have is a plan for who's going to decide what to say, and who else is going to contribute to that, and what is the SLA for all of those contributors to make sure we can get this out as quickly as possible. And so I mentioned this a little earlier about really steering the executive attention towards the things that are most important for a successful incident response. So attention is a higher order process within our brain, meaning that it actually directs other processes, right? It helps us assess the situation, and then it's actually going to allocate the cognitive resources, right? It tells us what to be thinking about, what decisions need to be made. And so it really matters where we're focusing people's attention during an incident. It also directs our perceptual processes and influences how we receive the information about the situation. If executives are focusing on the wrong thing, it's not going to matter how many times you throw facts at them about the security investigation. They are obsessed with this other thing over here, and we've got to pull their attention off of that thing that doesn't matter, because we need them to focus on the most important tasks at hand. And attention is heavily impacted by our thoughts, right? This is why I care so much about monitoring and scanning and getting to know what makes all of these executives tick, because their beliefs and their expectations are going to impact the way that they think about what's going on, and their emotional state, whether they are fearful or anxious about what's happening, is also going to steer their attention towards what they perceive to be the threats, right? Which may be something like a media inquiry. I have never seen a company go through a breach that went out of business because of a media statement. The media can wait. It is not your number one priority during an incident. Do you eventually need to have that conversation and publicly share the details? Yes, of course. And I'm not suggesting that you ignore media questions. But every company I have ever encountered can survive a bumpy day in the news, right? A bumpy day in the news is not going to take you down. If you are not transparent when you do communicate, or if you try to minimize what's happening when you communicate, that's what's really going to have an impact long-term for your business. And so why does all of this matter in terms of the executive attention and making sure that they're focused on the right things? It's because there's a large range of important information that's actually competing for executives' attention during an incident. And our response plans need to help them focus on the most important tasks. I mentioned this at the very beginning, where we need executives to be focused on the decisions and the judgments that only they can make because of the role and authority that they have within the organization. And this is best achieved when, spoiler alert, they're not panicked. We want them to make smart decisions and to have the best, clearest judgment possible. So keeping our executives out of a panicked mode helps us get to the best outcomes from a security perspective as well. And so I want to introduce you to this concept of task loading. This is something that we talk about a lot in rescue diving because it has a huge impact on diver panic and things that could trigger diver panic. So as humans, our capacity to process information is limited. Our brains can only do so much at once, right? And new and unfamiliar tasks require a significant amount of this limited capacity. So for a new diver, if they are using new equipment, if they are diving with a camera for the first time, if they have, if their wetsuit doesn't fit quite right and they're kind of struggling with it, these things take up a lot of space in our mind. And that pulls that capacity away from other things. And as new tasks build up, or as we're loaded with more and more simultaneous tasks, we're actually going to tap out our capacity to be able to accept new information or to do additional tasks. Fortunately, more familiar tasks require less conscious effort, right? This is why, for those of us that are trained as rescue divers, we can identify things quickly and respond to them in a more calm and relaxed manner to actually mitigate the emergency and prevent panic within ourselves, because these are familiar tasks for us. If you've been involved in incident response, probably a lot of the tasks that you do seem very familiar and very routine to you. The challenge that we have during incident response when we look company-wide is that not all of the other stakeholders that engage with us on those issues are as familiar with not just our tasks, but their tasks. They may, again, if they're only talking about security when they have to, they're maybe talking about it a couple times a year, if that, right? Which means every time they're doing it, it's actually a new task for them. They have not developed the muscle memory or the cognitive memory to be able to make these rote tasks for them. And so every incident is using up a huge percentage of their cognitive capacity. And so the more familiar a task or skill becomes, the less capacity it requires. So I want incident response to be something that my executives can do in their sleep. Because if they don't do it often enough, then every time they do have to do it, it's like they're learning something new all over again, and they're not going to have the capacity they need to make those good decisions and to practice sound judgment. And so how do we actually do this, right? How do we actually get the executives to focus on the right thing and not like the shiny object? We assign tasks to them, we get them to agree to those tasks, and we practice like crazy all the time. So how many of you are familiar with the racing model? Okay, perfect. This is not something I invented, want to make that very clear. This is very popular in, business management and other types of project management situations. Essentially, for those of you who aren't familiar, for each task, you have a party or a team, or perhaps a function within a company who is responsible for that task. They initiate it, and it is their job to see it through to completion. There is an accountable party. These are the people who have to sign off. They may not start it, but they have to give the okay before it can be completed. So in the case of incident response, maybe it's the PR team starts the public statement, but the legal team has to sign off on it before it's actually sent out externally from the company. Third, there is consulted parties, and there are informed parties. Consulted parties are the folks that may have to contribute. So again, if we go back to that example of a public statement about a data breach, I certainly hope, although this is not always true, but I would certainly hope that your security team has some input on what is said publicly, just to make sure that, it's actually true. And then the informed parties are the folks who make it the FYI or the memo, or you need to have visibility that this is happening because you've got other tasks going on and you need to be aligned. It's really important to get buy-in and approval from the stakeholders for these assignments before an incident happens. Number one, because they're not yet panicked. And so it is just a far better conversation about who's responsible for what when people are not panicked and freaking out, right? And number two, because it is so helpful to be able to show them all of the things that need to happen in incident response that they don't want to be part of, right? When I've done tabletop exercises with companies, when I ask who's responsible for customer communications, I will have 4 different people raise their hand. No. You can't have 4 people responsible for something. You're either going to duplicate your work or it's not going to get done, right? We pick one person who is responsible, and everybody else who thinks they need to have an opinion on that thing can be a consulted party, right? But what I have found is that when we go through the whole list of all these things, some of these auxiliary functions, like HR, are like, oh God, please don't include me in that unless you absolutely have to, because there's a list of 20 things and we only have 2 people on our team. Perfect. Fewer stakeholders, we can go faster, right? So it's really helpful to actually help the executives visualize everything that needs to happen, because it forces them to select the small number of things that they actually want to be part of, that we need them to be part of. So obviously my focus is in communication. So when I do this with clients, the 4 areas that we focus on most often are communications that happen during an investigation. Who's going to be part of the communications if we need to reach out to the AWS security team or the GitHub security team? Who's in charge of those communications? Any communication that is leaving our environment is up for grabs when it comes to, potentially making its way to the public, but also impacting our relationships with really important partners who could help us get the answers that we need for an investigation. Second, we're looking at notification communications. This is where we work most closely with our legal colleagues to make sure that we are meeting the regulatory requirements, but also so that we make sure our notifications don't suck. Right? Nobody wants to get a notification that sounds like my lawyer wrote it. Nobody. We also look at corporate communications. This is where the PR team usually comes into play, or the marketing team, whoever's responsible for that function. And then finally, we will look at customer support communications. Who's going to reach out to the customers, not just if they need to be notified, but just to let them know that we're looking into something, right? For example, if we go back to the Okta example, somebody needs to tell the customers that we're at least aware of what's happening, and we're not like sitting on our thumbs, we're looking to investigate our own environment. So those are the 4 typical categories that we look at, and we will list out all of the communication tasks that need to happen in those buckets and make sure that every single one of them has a responsible party, an accountable party, that we're consulting the right people, and that the people who just need to know but don't need to slow us down, they can get the FYI memo, and then we can talk about, what is the frequency of those communications, right? Can I send it to you at the end of the day rather than every minute, because my security team actually needs to be focused on remediation. And so practice, practice, practice. The more we can use our incident response plans, the better we will be at executing them. And more importantly, the better our stakeholders and our executives will be at executing their parts, right? So these are just kind of some example categories that I talk about a lot in our client work, where everybody kind of looks at that top line where it's like the intrusion, the data, like the big things that you read in the headlines, right? I want my security teams to be using our incident response plan on everything. Right? If there's a product vulnerability, follow the plan, right? You don't have to go through every level of escalation, particularly if it's a minor incident, but we need to get our stakeholders normalized and familiar with all of the different types of incidents that happen, so that they can use this plan over and over and over again, so that they are in tip-top shape for when it matters the most. Right? So if your plan is too cumbersome to be used on a daily basis with these, routine incidents that we all have all the time, it's probably not the right plan. And you're only going to be using it in those big moments where, again, your stakeholders are unfamiliar with this task every time they're encountered with it. And they're not at the optimal cognitive position to be able to make the right kinds of decisions that we hope that they would. And so a couple of closing thoughts before I end. Just a couple of boss mode tips for folks. I highly recommend that you commit up front with your executive team that you will use every incident to strengthen your reputation. I look at security incidents as opportunities. When else is the entire world willing to listen to you? Use that to talk about security. Use that to point to the things that you have been investing in, that you have been building. And if you have been doing all of the other things that we talked about in terms of creating content, engaging in community discussions, you will actually have a history of content information that you can point back to, right? Build a library of credible content for yourself. Second is that it's really not a crisis until you make it one. How you respond to the incident matters a lot more than the incident itself, from your executive's perspective. Your executives are concerned about financial loss, reputation loss, and regulatory investigations, right? How you respond to the incident is what impacts those things. And lastly, take care of your IR team. One of the things that is most, that I have found most satisfactory doing this work is knowing that the less panicked the executives are, the less pressure there is on the IR team. I can take better care of IR teams and their mental health and their well-being if I don't have trigger-happy executives breathing down their neck. And with that, I will open it up for questions. Yes?
So when you're talking about practice, do tabletop exercises help with that? Can that kind of help people get into that practice mode?
Yeah, I recommend tabletop exercises as a really good introduction, especially for stakeholders who have never been involved in incidents before or have never been involved in incidents at your particular organization, right? When you introduce them to like, here's the new process or here's the updated process, right? I think it's important to have those on a regular basis, whether it's, biannually or quarterly or whatever works for your organization. But again, you can imagine, you know how many of the resources it takes to pull together something like that. You can't do that every Tuesday, right? But every Tuesday, there's something happening on your security team that they're investigating, right? Follow your plan, at least, to the point of escalation where it makes sense for that particular scenario, right? So that by the time something really big happens, your executives should be able to do step 1 through 3 with their eyes closed. Any other questions? If you're ever in Tulum and you want to go scuba diving, let me know. All right, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming. Enjoy the rest of your conference.